Hello, friends and audiobook fans. Today's episode is one of my top recommended titles from 2021. One of the most frequent questions we hear from listeners is whether we'd consider expanding on our theme and taking a deeper look into fiction and other sources of fascinating ideas. If you're one of our listeners who asked for this, we heard you and thank you for your suggestions. We'll be hard at work behind the scenes for the rest of this year, creating something we hope you'll love. Until then, we hope you enjoy this episode, and I look forward to sharing more with you in 2022. When you encounter conflict, you have a few options: running away, fighting, or staying silent. This next title presents a fourth way: leaning in to conflict. Welcome to Audiobook Reviews in 5. This is Yana, also known as Jana, and in today's episode, I'm reviewing High Conflict, Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out, written and read by Amanda Ripley. Investigative journalist and New York Times best-selling author Amanda Ripley defines high conflict as a conflict that becomes self-perpetuating and all-consuming, in which almost everyone ends up worse off. Like gravity, it exerts its force on nearly everyone else, and when we're magnetized by this hyper-vigilant state, we feel an involuntary need to defend our side and attack the other. High conflict isn't always violent, but its extreme volatility can easily trip into violence. For some people, this is a way of life. In conflict-habituated marriages, for example, there is a state of chronic and continuous tension, even if partners mostly keep it controlled in public view. For most of us, though, high conflict hijacks our brain when we feel threatened, discounted, or humiliated. And in this state, our brain behaves differently, and it can be incredibly energizing to feel righteous and angry, pitting ourselves as us against them and good versus evil. We feel increasingly certain of our own superiority and, at the same time, more and more mystified by the other side. But here lies the trap. Once we pit ourselves against the insanity of the other side, in our politics, at work, or at home, it's because we aren't seeing how the conflict itself has taken over. Ripley uses a brilliant, albeit grim, analogy of California's La Brea tar pits here. It's the source of one of the biggest collections of Ice Age fossils in the world, including those of woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers. For thousands of years, the pits became death traps to unwitting animals who wandered in and attracted predators with their struggle to escape. Much like the millions of creatures who became trapped in that murky goo, when we're lured into a feud, we become helpless against the pull of high conflict. I'm willing to bet that you know exactly what high conflict looks and feels like. Maybe you feel trapped in one right now. But while anger has a place in conflict, it's not transformative on its own. In Ripley's words, quote, "Adversarialism depends on total, complete, and permanent separation. In the real world, no such thing exists most of the time," unquote. There are countless books on conflict mediation and communication, but the reason I'm recommending this one is that the storytelling is magic. Ripley's writing and narration made this impossible for me to put down. Some of the highlights include the transformation of a Chicago gang leader who dedicates his life to a vendetta, only to find himself working beside the man who killed his childhood idol. Then there's the member of the Colombian FARC guerrilla group who successfully extracts herself from a life of violence. There's also a touching story about a group of liberal Manhattan Jews and conservative Michigan corrections officers who choose to stay in each other's homes to better understand each other. But my favorite story is about Gary Friedman, a world-renowned conflict mediator, author, and former trial lawyer. Gary runs for local office in his town of Muir Beach, California, fully confident that his experience will set troubled relationships with townsfolk back on the right track. But instead, Gary further incites deep divisions in the town and makes enemies of former friends and allies. With this setup, you might think, well, if a conflict expert can get trapped in the tar pit, how is there any hope for the rest of us? But that's exactly why you should listen to this title. Ripley shows us how Friedman is able to come back from the brink just in time to rescue his relationships and recover his sense of self. The path out of high conflict depends on a disruption, something that breaks the spell. It can be as simple as a snowstorm or the funeral of a mutual acquaintance. Escaping high conflict also requires our humility and curiosity, but how it unfolds looks different in each journey that Ripley shares with us. She shows us how to spot some of the warning signs of high conflict and how to reframe our perspective so we can enjoy productive disagreements. She also explains the role of conflict entrepreneurs, people who exploit high conflict for their own ends. Ripley's narration of her own book is outstandingly excellent, with perfect pacing and a tone that kept me engaged. Her journalistic skills make this impossible to put down as she shared story after story of real people, often including audio excerpts of their voices for a personal touch. She uses data strategically to emphasize her illustrations as well, and she weaves in her own experiences, like the sensation of feeling most American while in a foreign country and having to explain American politics to critics. This audiobook is riveting, and best of all, it's profoundly useful in that it illustrates multiple ways we can escape conflict traps that we set for ourselves and instead strengthen our relationships and productive communication. I absolutely loved this listen, and I recommend it to everyone. That's all for this episode of Audiobook Reviews in 5. Thanks for listening. If you have not yet done so, please follow us on Facebook and subscribe to Audiobook Reviews in 5 on Anchor, Apple, Spotify, and many others. By subscribing, you help increase the profile of this podcast and chances of other listeners finding it. I look forward to checking in with you all again soon. Please stay safe and be well.